Will UPI stop being free? The truth behind UPI charges. Money is everywhere, but understanding it is a different story. This is Money Mosaic, where we connect the pieces, uncover hidden costs, and break down the money decisions that affect your everyday life. Let's put the pieces together. You scan a QR code, enter 500, press pay, and the payment is done. No extra charge, no transaction fee. For millions of Indians, that's everyday life. But now there's a question spreading rapidly. Will UPI stop being free? You may have already seen headlines suggesting that UPI charges are coming. But here's where the story gets interesting. The government has clarified that consumers will not be charged for making normal UPI payments. Person-to-person UPI transactions will continue to remain free. So why is everyone talking about UPI charges? Because the real story isn't necessarily about charging you. It's about who pays for UPI. And that could have consequences for merchants, businesses, and eventually the prices you pay. Part 1. What actually changed? Let's clear up the biggest confusion first. The recent debate is around something called MDR, Merchant Discount Rate. MDR is essentially a fee associated with processing certain digital payments, generally paid by the merchant rather than the customer. For ordinary bank account to bank account UPI, the existing structure has kept MDR at zero. But the government has recently clarified that it is considering a limited merchant-side MDR framework for certain transactions, while keeping UPI free for consumers. That means the headline, UPI users will be charged, is misleading. The more accurate question is, could some businesses eventually pay a fee when customers use UPI? That's a very different story. Part 2. Why does UPI need money? Here's the part most consumers never think about. When you make a UPI payment, it looks simple. Scan, enter PIN, done. But behind those few seconds is an enormous digital infrastructure. Banks, payment service providers, NPCI, fraud monitoring, cybersecurity, servers, technology, customer support, settlement systems. All of this costs money, and yet ordinary UPI payments have been designed to remain free for users. The government has supported the ecosystem through incentives to participating banks and payment providers. So the bigger financial question is, how should this enormous payment infrastructure be funded as UPI continues to grow? That is where MDR enters the debate. Part 3. Who actually pays MDR? Imagine you visit a large store and buy something for $10,000. You scan the store's UPI QR code. You pay $10,000. You see 10,000 cent. You don't see an additional UPI charge. Under a merchant-side MDR model, the fee is deducted from the merchant's settlement rather than added directly to your payment. So if a hypothetical MDR were 0.5%, a 10,000 transaction could mean 50 in processing cost for the merchant. You still pay 10,000. The merchant receives less after the applicable fee. That's the basic idea. But here's where the debate becomes complicated. Part 4. Could merchants pass the cost to you? This is the question consumers should actually care about. Suppose a business starts paying a payment processing fee. The business now has 3 choices: absorb the cost, increase prices, or discourage certain payment methods. For a large company with healthy margins, a small payment processing cost may be manageable. For a small business operating on thin margins, even a small percentage can matter. So could some merchants eventually try to recover the cost from customers? It's possible, but that does not mean every UPI payment will suddenly become more expensive, and it does not mean merchants are automatically allowed to add a random UPI fee to your bill. The exact rules and implementation matter. So don't confuse merchant-side MDR with a direct UPI fee charged to you. They are not the same thing. The 2000 question. You may have heard another number repeatedly. 2000. Why? Because some discussions around potential MDR have focused on higher value merchant transactions. But there's another important development you should know about. From June 1st, 2026, Canara Bank's merchant notice states that MDR applies to RuPay Credit Card payments made through UPI above 2,000, with the rate depending on the merchant category. GST is also applicable to the MDR amount. Notice the crucial difference. This is RuPay Credit Card on UPI. It is not the same thing as paying directly from your bank account through normal UPI. That's an important distinction. If you use a credit card through UPI, The economics are different because you're using borrowed money. So when you hear UPI charges above 2000, don't immediately assume every UPI transaction above 2000 is being charged. Look at which payment instrument is being used and which merchant transaction is covered. Part 6. Why the government wants UPI to remain free. There's a simple reason. UPI has become part of everyday Indian commerce. You use it for groceries, restaurants, bills, travel, online purchases, small shops, large retailers, person-to-person transfers. If customers suddenly had to pay a fee every time they scanned a QR code, adoption could be affected. The government has therefore emphasized that consumers should continue to be able to use UPI without transaction charges. The challenge is balancing two things: keeping UPI affordable, while also ensuring the ecosystem that operates it remains financially sustainable. Part 7. Why merchants are important. Here's something people often forget. UPI isn't just a consumer payment system, it's also a business infrastructure. For a small shopkeeper, accepting UPI means customers don't need cash. For a customer, it means instant payment. For banks and payment companies, it means enormous transaction volumes. The problem is that huge transaction volume doesn't automatically mean huge revenue. So the industry faces a basic economic question. How do you maintain a massive payment network when the core payment experience is expected to remain free? That's one reason MDR keeps returning to the conversation. Part 8. The bigger risk for consumers. The biggest risk isn't necessarily UPI will suddenly charge 10 per payment. That's not what the government has announced. The bigger risk is indirect. Imagine a merchant eventually faces higher payment costs. If that merchant raises prices by a small amount across thousands of products, consumers could indirectly bear part of the cost. But again, that's a possible economic effect, not a current blanket UPI charge. This distinction is extremely important. Don't turn a policy discussion into a panic headline. Part 9. What should you do? For now, don't panic. If you normally use bank account UPI to pay a shopkeeper, you should not assume you're suddenly going to receive a transaction fee. Instead, watch three things. First, what payment method are you actually using? Bank account UPI, credit card through UPI, wallet? These can have different economics. Second, is the charge officially announced? Don't trust random social media screenshots. Look for information from the government, RBI, NPCI, or your bank. Third, if a merchant asks you to pay an extra UPI fee, ask what the charge is for. Don't automatically assume every additional amount is a legitimate UPI charge. Part 10, the final verdict. So will UPI stop being free? For consumers, the current answer is no. The government has explicitly clarified that consumers and person-to-person UPI transactions will remain free. But the economics behind UPI are changing. The debate is increasingly about who should fund the infrastructure: merchants, banks, payment companies, government incentives, or some combination. And that's why this story matters. Because today, you may not pay anything extra when you scan a QR code. But the way India's digital payment ecosystem is funded could influence businesses, payment companies, and eventually the prices around you. So don't believe UPI is no longer free, and don't assume nothing is changing. The truth is somewhere in between. A QR code may look simple, but behind that 2-second payment is an entire financial ecosystem. And whenever money moves, someone pays for the infrastructure that makes it possible. The important question isn't just, will I be charged? It's who pays, how much, and what happens next. This is Money Mosaic. Connect the pieces. Understand the money. And remember, don't follow the headline, follow the money.